Japan's foreign policy in the crucial year of 1941 to 42 was determined by domestic issues. In this case, the increasing control that the military now had on the government and the economic concerns arising from the U.S. blockade on Japan. The economic embargo placed on Japan as a result of its expansion into Indochina would be fatal in the long term for Japan. The Japanese could not sustain the war in China if their key supplies were cut off. Therefore, a war of conquest to gain and ensure resources from the European colonies seemed to be the only option. However, opinion in Japan was divided on the question of expanding the war. Some argued that Japan could withdraw its forces from Indochina and thus get the embargo lifted. Others wanted no retreat and did not view the U.S. as a real danger to their ambitions.
This is an excerpt from David Liu's book. David Liu is a former professor of East Asian Studies at Bucknell University, and he wrote in 1961, prior to the outbreak of war in Europe, Japan entertained no territorial designs towards French Indochina. Its objectives were to gain French recognition of the state of war in China and of Japan's belligerent rights. Back in 1938, Japan repeatedly asked the French Indo-Chinese authorities to halt shipment of war materials to Chiang Kai-shek and had received no satisfaction. The War, Navy, and Foreign Ministries of Japan advanced the idea of bombing the Yunnan Railroad, which was built by the French, forcing a diplomatic settlement. But no concrete action was taken until the fall of 1939. So, of course, David Liu is a revisionist historian, and you can see where he's going back and saying, wait, traditional historians, you are blaming fully Japan. And most sources do actually blame Japan for dragging the U.S. into the war. But he's arguing that actually the invasion of Indochina, which led to war with the United States, was provoked by the French. So a very fascinating, different perspective than what we're actually learning.
Negotiations between the U.S. and Japan continued throughout 1941. Washington wanted Japan to agree to respect the territorial integrity of its neighbors, to pursue its policy by peaceful means, and to maintain an open-door trade policy in areas under its control. Japan could not agree to these conditions, and the deadlock continued into August. While negotiations with the United States continued, the military in Japan made alternative plans. The Japanese Navy presented its plan for war to the Japanese cabinet, and after some debate, a plan was agreed upon on September 4, 1941. Even then, the Japanese government continued with negotiations and diplomacy with the United States. A final Japanese mission was sent to Washington to try to agree to terms with the Americans. However, at the same time, a huge naval task force prepared secretly to attack the United States should negotiations fail. When the negotiations stalled, final preparations were made for an attack on the American naval base in Hawaii. On November 2nd, in a final imperial conference, the Privy Council President Hara summed the matter up as follows. It is impossible from the standpoint of our present political situation and our self-preservation to accept all of the American demands. Therefore, I recognize that it is inevitable that we must decide to start a war against the United States. I will put my trust in what I have been told, namely that things will go well in the early part of the war, and that although we will experience increasing difficulties as the war progresses, there is some prospect of success. On December 7, 1941, Japanese bombers attacked U.S. ships and installations at Pearl Harbor in an attempt to destroy the U.S. Pacific Fleet. If successful, this would have rendered the United States temporarily helpless to resist Japanese expansion. Japan could then conquer and consolidate its control in Southeast Asia before the United States had time to rebuild its naval capability. The attack on Pearl Harbor did incur huge losses for the United States, with 90% of the mid-Pacific air and sea power either destroyed or badly damaged. However, the Japanese had not destroyed the U.S. aircraft carrier capability. Indeed, several carriers had been out on maneuvers and were not hit. This would later prove a fatal mistake for Japan. The U.S. government was outraged by the attack on Pearl Harbor, which was described by President Roosevelt as dastardly. The duplicitous nature of conducting negotiations in the United States while simultaneously sending an attack fleet across the Pacific was seen as entirely deceitful and treacherous. The brutal air assault killed 2,403 and injured 1,178 U.S. military personnel and civilians before any declaration of war was made. However, the Japanese historian Machiko Hasegawa argues that the attack on Pearl Harbor was not in line with Japan's long-term planning and was caused by the oil embargo, which forced Japan into war. Revisionist historians go as far as to argue that Roosevelt deliberately provoked Japan into making an attack. As they attacked Pearl Harbor, Japan simultaneously attacked Hong Kong and Singapore. Japanese forces then went on to attack the Dutch East Indies, the Philippines, and Malay on December 8th. By the end of December, Japan had seized control of Guam, Hong Kong, and the Wake Islands. They also had sunk two important British warships, the Prince of Wales and the Repulse. Japan had taken Indochina, Siam, and the Dutch East Indies, Malay, Singapore, and the Philippines by mid-1942. The historian Kenneth Pyle sums up the impact of Japan's actions. Japan paid a terrible price for the bold gamble of its leaders in 1941. Abandoning the cautious realism that had traditionally characterized Japanese diplomacy, the nation entered into a conflict that cost it the lives of nearly 3 million Japanese, its entire overseas empire, and the destruction of 1/4 of its machines, equipment, buildings, and houses. Generations were left physically and psychologically scarred by the trauma. The outcome was heavy with historic irony. War sentiment in Japan had been impelled by an ultra-nationalist ideology that sought to preserve the traditional values of the Japanese political order, that vehemently opposed the expansion of Bolshevik influence in Asia, and that wanted to establish the Japanese empire. Instead, war brought a social democratic revolution at home, the rise of communism in China, and, for the first time in Japan's history, occupation by an enemy force.